This week on Quadriga, 1 year Morsi, Egypt's thwarted democracy. The opposition is planning to mobilize millions of Egyptians to protest the first anniversary of Mohammed Morsi's election as president. Morsi's government is accused of clamping down on opposition activists, the judiciary and media. Ordinary Egyptians are fed up with the dire economic conditions they have to endure. Egypt's fledgling democracy can at best be described as weak. Responding to the rising tide of discontent, Egypt's defense minister says the military may intervene to prevent the state from collapsing. Egyptians are deeply divided on the way forward. The country's democratic experiment is on the brink of failure. Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Hopes have been dashed. Unrest is on the rise. Is Egypt becoming ungovernable? That's what we want to talk about today on Quadriga with three guests who've been following the situation there closely. Ebtisam Ali Hussein is an Egyptian graduate student at Berlin's Free University. She writes for Arabic media outlets, and she formerly worked at the Cairo office of Germany's Friedrich Naumann Foundation, a political think tank. Ahmed Badawi is also from Egypt. He's the co-executive director of Transform, a Berlin-based organization that specializes in conflict resolution. He previously also worked for the International Crisis Group, among other organizations, and he has reported from Egypt for print and television media. And Jan Kuhlmann is a freelance German journalist specializing in the Middle East and the Arab world. He has reported for the DPA news agency in Tel Aviv, and he now works for a variety of newspapers and radio stations. Welcome to all of you. I'd like to start out by getting an impression of what you've been hearing from your home country, Ebtisam Ali Hussein. How bad is the situation in Egypt these days?
Well, for the last 2 weeks, everyone is worried about the 30th of June. But the thing is that the violence already started like 2 days ago in Mansoura, with people getting killed and others getting, like hundreds are getting injured in clashes between the proponents and the opponents of the regime. So it's not even the 30th yet, and everyone is like getting excited about it, and the violence already started.
The 30th, of course, being the date for which these very large demonstrations are planned. Ahmed Badawi, what are you hearing? Life wasn't exactly easy before the revolution or before Mr. Morsi came to power. Has it really gotten that much worse for people?
Yes. Costs of basic commodities have increased. Sometimes it even doubled. People are finding it difficult to make ends meet. There are shortages of power, of petrol, of food. People are feeling less safe. Crime has gone up. I've just seen a statistic. The incidence of robbery has increased by 350% in the last year. So things are worse than before. But of course, we have to put this in perspective. It's a revolutionary period, and the expectation that things were going to be better very soon, that was not realistic to start with.
Our report at the start of the program said that the government could be called weak at best. Would you say, Jan Kuhlmann, that in fact Egypt is heading toward ungovernability?
Well, at least you can say that it's very, very difficult to govern this country because, as Ahmed Badawi has said, everything is in a revolutionary process, and that's a very, very long road Egypt has to take in the next years. And this is nothing which you can. This is not a problem which you can solve in just a very short time, in 1 year or in 2 years. So it takes a lot of time because you have so many different problems. You have problems with the old system, which is still everywhere in the ministries. You have a lot of strong powers in the ministries and other organizations which don't want Egypt to be a democracy. You have a very strong contradiction between the opposition and the government. And you have, of course, as we have heard, the very, very difficult economical situation. So it's very hard to govern the country, and I don't envy any president to be in charge of the country.
The fact is the unrest has also been chasing away tourists and investors. Foreign currency reserves are half of what they were under President Mubarak. Let's take a quick look at that economic situation that Ahmed Badawi just told us about.
Domestic and international investors have been pulling their money out of the Egyptian stock exchange. The government needs to borrow billions to plug a huge deficit. Egypt's weak economy is in free fall. Foreign reserves have been depleted. The Egyptian pound has fallen to record lows, and millions of people are unemployed. A fuel shortage, which the government blames on black market speculation, is compounding problems. Tourism, the mainstay of the economy, is stagnant because foreigners are afraid to visit an unstable Egypt. The economy is proving as big a threat to Egypt's future as the country's political divisions.
Ebtisam Ali Hussein, Mr. Morsi didn't exactly inherit an intact economy and political system. Is he really to be blamed for the pitiful state of the economy?
This is one objective perspective to the whole situation in Egypt. I've always said corruption, infrastructure problems, and economic difficulties are not new to the Egyptian, to Egypt. It's things have been going worse and deteriorating during the time of Mubarak, and now they are just a little bit getting even worse. We were not living in paradise with Mubarak, and Mubarak and his regime deteriorated and even brought the whole country into misery with the economy, with the corruption, and with the infrastructure trouble. So you're right. I mean, this is not new.
Ahmed Badawi, do you agree, or would you say that the government has made grave economic mistakes?
I think the problem of the government is that it hasn't done enough to try to change the economic situation. Of course, it inherited a very difficult economic situation. The Egyptian economy has always been a puzzle. It's been somehow surviving, but with very serious structural problems in the Egyptian economy. The economy has actually been the economy has been growing. It grew by 2% in the last year, but of course this is not enough, and it's very little compared to the 7% that it grew in the early 2000s. So the problems are so deep, and the government has not done grave mistakes, but what they haven't done is to come up with any realistic plan other than the loan that they would like to get from the International Monetary Fund. They haven't come up with any convincing plan, at least for me, to how are they going to change this economy around.
To what extent is the government strong enough, Jan Koolman, to take the kind of measures that it would have to take to start turning the economy around?
I would say that I would agree that the government hasn't made any grave mistakes concerning the economy, but I think we shouldn't look at this point just isolated, because I mean, if you want to improve the economy, you need stability, you need political stability, and I think this is the biggest failure of the government. It's very, very bad governance, and that it hasn't managed for different reasons, which we can talk about the reasons, but as a matter of fact, the government hasn't managed to bring political stability to the country, which means, I mean, you can talk a lot about economy, you can talk a lot about loans, but if you don't have political stability, the economy will not grow.
What does political stability mean to you then, in that case?
I mean, you need political stability, you need a quiet environment, for example, for the investors. So Egypt really needs foreign investors to come to Egypt. But I mean, anyone who's looking at Egypt thinks, why should I bring my money to Egypt? I don't know what will be in the country, what will be the political situation in half a year or in 1 year. So this is one of the main problems. Before you can talk about economy, you have to talk about political stability.
But that has to do, of course, with the popular unrest. The fact is, Ebtisam Ali Hussein, President Morsi has not gotten a lot of cooperation from the opposition. Is that his fault or their fault?
I would say it's his fault, because actually the Muslim Brotherhood, even before the election of President Morsi, were quite persistent in terms of their willingness and readiness to dominate politics in Egypt. This was quite even clearer after the presidency of Morsi, because then you can see it everywhere in the drafting of the constitution, you can see it in the resistance to the constitutional court verdicts concerning the Shura Council, you can see it in every aspect. They are also penetrating the military.
They being the Muslim Brotherhood?
The Muslim Brotherhood. So you can see that they are deliberately excluding other forces from the political scene. And all the conferences and the summits and the meetings with the opposition are quite facade-oriented, like they are not real. They're just...
But could that have gone a different way, Ahmed Badawi? Was there any goodwill there at the beginning, apart from the Muslim Brotherhood? Obviously, they support Morsi, but did he have any goodwill that he could have drawn upon in the beginning?
I think they have goodwill, but they don't have the correct view of the world. They don't have the correct tools. It's a very difficult question because I think everybody is to blame. The design of the transition process itself was faulty from the beginning. They moved too quickly. They wanted to cover a lot of ground in a very short period of time. Of course, the Muslim Brothers, they've made a fatal strategic mistake by wanting to monopolize power too early. That is a big mistake, and I think they will pay the price for this now. I think it would have been much better for them, much better for the whole country, had they tried to be patient and tried to broaden consensus, rather than use the argument that, well, we've got the majority, so in a democratic system, we have the right to do everything we want to do. That is a strategic mistake. Now they are going to take the blame for a country that is very difficult to govern. And by wanting to govern it on their own, they will be stuck with almost all of the blame now.
I would agree with this, but we have to see that we have a very polarized country. You have very strong powers on the, let's say, more liberal, on the left side, on the secular side, which put the president under pressure. But on the same time, you have a very strong, very strong power upon the very religious parties, upon the Salafi parties, which also put the president under tremendous pressure. So this is the main task for him, to find a balance between these two powers, between these two sides, and this is what he didn't manage to do. And I think sometimes we just, it's just too easy to say it's his fault because he didn't make any, he didn't find any agreement with the opposition, with the secular powers in the country. But don't forget the Salafis. I mean, they're very strong in the country. They had very good results in the elections, and they also put the government under pressure. And this is, for example, how we can look at, we have new governors in some parts of Egypt, and people said, oh, look at him, he chose one of the most radicals. Yeah, it's very difficult for him because they are very strong, the Salafis and the radical powers in Egypt.
And in terms of appointing these new governors, 17 new governors were appointed. 7 of them are from the Muslim Brotherhood. When the Brotherhood and Morsi were criticized for that, Ibtisam Ali Hussein, he said, well, look, I've been rebuffed. I've been rejected so many times from the opposition. I simply have no choice. Isn't there something to that?
The choice, the selection of the governors is awfully out of touch, because one, specifically the one for Luxor, is actually one who was in the Jama'a Islamiyya, in the
a group regarded as a terrorist group.
Not only that, he was inside the armed struggle arm of it. I mean, he was involved in violence actually in Luxor during the time of Mubarak. So it's kind of astonishing what they're doing, because you don't have to choose someone with a criminal record in order to appease the Jama'a Islamiyya or Salafists or other Islamic groups. So in terms of generally speaking, yeah, the selection of the governors was quite, I would say, lousy. But for this particular guy in Luxor, it was quite astonishing. And many people do not really believe that at this critical point before the 30th of June, he would make such a move with such selections to just further agitate the populace.
But let's try to see it from a different point of view. I agree with you that it's very difficult to have a governor who belongs to a very extremist party and who was involved in the armed struggle against the government in the 80s, even if this government was a dictatorship. But what happened? So this guy became governor. So you had a lot of protests and demonstration against it. So what did he do? After 2 days, he stepped back. So, I mean, if you look at the whole transformation process, and if you look at it from a democratic point of view, I mean, this is just it's perfect, because the people, they said what they think of it, and this had an effect. So from this whole transformation process, I think it was very good what happened.
Let me ask about religious intolerance, because that was something that people had been very, very worried about prior to the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power. Ahmed Badawi, is it on the rise? Are you seeing signs of rising intolerance in your country?
I'm seeing a rise of entrenchment. Intolerance has always been there, as well as tolerance. Egypt is very contradictory in this respect. What I see is an entrenchment behind religious slogans. Many times in the past 2 weeks I hear people saying, this is opposition against Islam. So there is a great deal of polarization. But let me go back to what you were saying. On the whole, I'm very positive about what's going on, precisely of what Jan just said now. The fact that protest leads to an outcome that is that was demanded by the protesters. This is something new. Egypt has gone a long way in terms of the capacity of the people to make their demands clear, the capacity of people to be politicized and to go out and to say, we want this and we want that. This is new, and this is a good, a positive sign. It doesn't mean that Egypt is going to be like Norway or Sweden or Germany tomorrow. But at least this is the beginning of a long and possibly a very painful process of transformation, and there are no shortcuts in history. It will probably have to get a lot worse before it gets better.
But the fact is, of course, that the idea of democracy is that people exercise that power at the ballot box, Ibtisam Ali Hussein, and not necessarily on the street. Have Egyptians perhaps learned the wrong lessons or learned them too fervently from the protests that toppled Mubarak, that they are impatient and see the street as the only place where they can exercise their political rights?
It's partly the success of the street politics that happened back then on the 25th of January and a few days afterwards. That kind of convinced the Egyptians that this is a very good and efficient way of making our demands. But at the same time, it also has to do with some kind of frustration with electoral politics, what you're talking about, of the ballots. Especially after the Muslim Brotherhood had large shares of seats inside the parliament, and it was quite lousy performance. So, and of course, President Morsi, the election of President Morsi later on was also another sign that electoral politics does not get them any better. So I think now Egypt is going through this phase of, okay, we will go and elect and cast a vote in the ballots when it's time for the elections. But it's also, street politics will stay vital and critical in this phase.
Let me come back to the question of where we're heading with the demonstrations in just a moment, but I would like to explore a bit more the current situation in regard to to religious intolerance and also the situation of women. But staying with the question of intolerance, first of all, Jan Kuhlmann, we're seeing a rise in religious blasphemy cases in the courts. Are you worried about the degree to which Egypt could tip toward a more fundamentalist Islamic system?
You always have to be worried about such cases, which you can see in Egypt quite often. The problem is that under the old government, everything like this was completely suppressed. So it wasn't allowed to have these kind of cases. So now it was, if something is suppressed afterwards, it's just like an explosion. So it comes out, and this is why it's very important that you have a stable political basis in the respect that you have a clear constitution. that you have a clear rule of law, that you have a working judiciary system. And if you have all this, you can deal with these cases of blasphemy. I'm a bit worried, but I don't think that this means Egypt is turning into an extremist religious country. The cases we have in Egypt, I think you always had problems between the different religious groups, between the Muslims and the Christians, of course. But I don't think that Egypt is going to turn into a religious extremist country. These are just singular cases, more or less, I would say. That's at least my hope.
Ahmed Badawi is nodding. Ibtisam Ali Hussein, I can't read your expression. Tell us about one other aspect. Elsewhere in the Middle East, of course, we're seeing rising confessional violence between Muslims, Sunnis and Shiites. What's the potential in your country for that kind of conflict? There just have been very violent demonstrations in which a number of Shiites were killed. What do you think?
It was starting the presidency, the election of President Morsi again, there were worries that it would come to that point where the conflict and the polarization between the Sunnis and the Shiites would further deteriorate and get worse. This happened like a few days ago, the casualties you just mentioned. But the thing is that we have to look for the external regional politics between the Muslim Brotherhood and other countries where the Sunnis dominate, in Saudi Arabia and other countries. And the very interesting part of it is that actually formal international politics between Egypt and Iran were on the rise. were improving before we had the casualties and the trouble with the Shiite. But it has to do with the discourse, and it has to do with the large loyalty and cooperation between the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and many Persian Gulf countries, which are Sunni-dominated. So,
Ahmed Badawi, is this something that concerns you going forward? Do you see the potential for your country to fall into the same kind of divisions that we're seeing elsewhere?
No. To start with, the Egyptian population is much more homogeneous than, say, Syria or even Libya. Of course, there are problems with the Copts, and there have always been problems with the Copts, starting from the 1970s, the Christian minority. Shiites, they're not even 1% of the population. So I don't see Egypt turning into another Iran. Even the nature of the Muslim Brothers as a political group, they're much more pragmatic. Who would have thought that an Islamist group in power would run after the IMF for a loan from the IMF with interest? Who would have thought that the relationship with Israel would have proceeded in the way that it has proceeded for the last 20, 30 years? So they have shown a great deal of pragmatism, and also from looking at similar groups who came to power before, for example, Hamas in Gaza. They have shown the same kind of pragmatism. So I don't see that the Muslim Brotherhood is taking Egypt into a more fundamentalist, extremist course. But of course, we have to keep in mind and we have to keep an eye on the Salafists, because they're putting they're pulling the Muslim Brothers to the right. And of course, the Muslim Brothers are very smart, so they're using now exactly the same argument that was used by Mubarak before. Implicitly, if it's not us, it will be the Salafists. So, of course, the argument is you're better off with us rather than the Salafists. And the same argument you hear in Tunisia. So the politics, the intra-Islamist political dimension, in addition to the regional dimension, is also very interesting. So we have to look inside the Islamist movement as well as regionally, and not just look at what's happening at the national level in Egypt.
Of course, there's also been a great deal of concern about what the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood could mean for Egypt's women. We have a few pictures. Let's take a look. Nearly 50% of women have reported more harassment since the revolution. Particularly violent incidents occurred around the first anniversary of the Tahrir Square protests, and Amnesty International has concluded that these were, quote, neither isolated nor unique, Amnesty also says that whether it's in the public or private spheres, at the hands of the state or non-state actors, violence against women in Egypt continues to go mostly unpunished. Ibtisam Ali Hussein, is it in fact objectively on the rise, or is the fact that simply more cases are now being reported and more women are out in public, again, pushing for their rights?
It's multifaceted because women starting the revolution, or maybe the last few years of Mubarak's presidency as well, they started more engagement in street politics. And this is also a factor that kind of increases the possibility for such incidents. So this is one dimension that was on the rise. Women are more engaged in street politics. But on the other side, it's also one way of putting a gender dimension to the whole situation in Egypt. Before Morsi and before the revolution, there was a very nasty argument against this harassment, where the government would say, and proponents of the Mubarak regime would say, well, it's their own fault because they go on the street, which was quite agitating. How can you say something like this?
There was a quote from one minister saying, how can I protect women if they're in the middle of men?
And this is the thing. But also you can think about it in terms, after the revolution, that now it's like thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are on the street, and it's really crowded, and you can never control what happens. I mean, we're speaking now de facto, empirically. But this is why I said the harassment is part of the culture now. It's unfortunately growing to be an integral feature of the Egyptian society. But at the same time, it's also more things coming up with women more engaged in the street.
Jan Kuman, there are also some rather troubling statistics about political participation by women. The number of women ministers has been reduced from 3 to just 1 now. There were no women on the committee that drafted amendments to the Constitution. So women clearly still second-class citizens in post-revolutionary Egypt.
I would definitely say so. I mean, and if you look at what the Muslim Brotherhood, if you're looking at the Muslim Brotherhood's position towards the women, they have a different idea of gender equality than, let's say, the secular powers in Egypt, or than we here in Europe or in Germany. That's for sure. So, but this is a very, very hard point, because on the one hand, I don't know if it's so easy. On the one hand, of course, you have these very conservative powers within the government or within the Salafis, of course. But on the other hand, as you have said, I mean, there were a lot of women in the opposition. A lot of women took part in the uprising against the old government, and I'm pretty sure that they're still engaged in policy and among the opposition parties. So I think that's also, there you can also see the strong polarization of the country, and this is just something which has to be fought out in the end.
To what degree, Ahmed Badawi, does the opposition actively support women's involvement and women's rights?
I think much more than the Islamists. Two things I'd like to add. First, there's a cultural dimension here. There is a problem with the status of women in Egyptian society, regardless of whether the Muslim Brothers are in power or whether Mubarak is in power. That's a cultural problem, and that requires long-term strategies to try to change the perception of Egyptian men about Egyptian women. So that's a cultural issue, it's a long-term issue, and it is not just something new. It has increased, of course, and because of all the reasons that Sam mentioned, but that's a chronic, deep problem in Egyptian society. And the other point I'd like to add, that traditionally discrimination in a patriarchal society like Egypt has not just been against women and against young people. And that's the other dimension that we usually forget. There is so much, there's so many restrictions from society, and not just from the politicians, not just from the Muslim Brothers, on the capacity of women and young people, whether men or women, to actively engage in the kind of politics that we're all hoping for. And that leaves the street as the only space for them to go and make their demands.
Young people were very active, of course, in the protests at Tahrir Square, Ibtisam Ali Hussein. What is their attitude now? Are they still involved in constructive political organization? And I guess that also relates to a more general question. How organized is the opposition? How much political institution building has been going on during this past year?
This is one of the fallacies of the Egyptian opposition. No one expected when the revolution took place that erupted that actually the opposition would be that much fragile and fragmented. Everyone thought millions of Egyptians were on the street. They were determined to oust Mubarak. It was great time. Egyptians, like Muslims, Copts, Muslim Brotherhood, liberals, everyone was on the street and they all worked for one goal, a single goal. But afterwards, they kind of split. They do not work anymore together, and it's all about who wins and who dominates and who's like. It's a very competitive atmosphere among the opposition forces, and this is why it's like they are also to blame for the whole apathy and indifference towards organized politics and more proneness to work on street politics.
I've heard that some of the young people who were quite involved in organizing Tahrir Square now basically have withdrawn and even say all they want is to leave the country and find good jobs elsewhere. Would you say that that's true within the circle of people you know?
It is true for many reasons, including not only political but also economic reasons. But at the same time, we have to think that on the 30th of June, it's going to be like expected that the rate and the numbers of people who are going to be on the street are going to be much more than, relatively speaking, after the 25th of January revolution.
Ahmed Badawi, please.
Tamarrud, this movement that is calling for the demonstrations on the 30th of June, I was looking at their names yesterday. They had this major press conference. And many of the people who are there, first of all, they're all young people, all the organizers are young, and many of them, 4 or 5 of them, are from the coalition, the first youth coalition that was established already on the 28th of January 2011, and then 1.5 years later it was disbanded. So some of these youth revolutionaries are actually coming back again through this movement of Tamarrud. The only problem, or the major problem that I see, and some people have already remarked on this, they need somehow very quickly to shift their strategy from short-term protest activity into long-term political strategic work. And this is what I think they haven't done yet, and I hope they manage to do that quickly.
Jan Koolman, where do you think these protests on the 30th could go? We've heard a general commander of the armed forces saying that the military is ready to step in if things get too out of hand. Do you think that's likely, and what are you expecting?
Well, it's a very difficult situation, and I think no one can say what the military exactly will do at the 30th of June. I think the best hope is that all the demonstrations will be peaceful demonstrations, that you have not any kind of violence. And I think if you don't have any violence, the military will not step in and will not engage. And this is, I mean, this is the most important thing. We have the demands for new elections now in Egypt from the ones organizing the demonstrations.
Indeed, they say they've collected millions of signatures, and that there's a petition that Morsi should step down, and they would like to see the Constitutional Court recognize that and divest him of power.
Yeah, I don't see where this should lead to, because we have had elections in Egypt. These elections were pretty free. These were the freest elections Egypt has ever seen in its whole history. And as a matter of fact, the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi have won the elections. And that's democracy that you can't say after 1 year, okay, but I was wrong, I voted for the wrong person, now I want him to step back. And I don't see that even if there were new elections, I don't see any other outcome. If you have new elections, I think the Muslim Brotherhood would still be pretty strong. And you might have another president, but you have another president and still the same problems and the same difficult situations. So I don't see that new elections will improve the situation. You really need something what I think is really urgent, that you need something like a national coalition government, so that you have a broad variety of different parties within the government, and you need from the president, you need some kind of, he has to take some of the demands of the opposition and talk about it, and probably we need also some changes in the constitution.
Ebtisam Ali Hussein, what, if anything, could the international community do to help stabilize the situation, perhaps to help bolster efforts to create that kind of bipartisan or multi-partisan cooperation within the government?
The problem is that the EU and the Americans even, all the time, formal politics, there are limits on intervention and the possibility of intervening with the country's domestic politics. So this is actually the answer you get from officials in Europe and the US once the whole issue with Egypt, helping the revolution, helping the opposition, they say, well, there are limits and we cannot do everything. So we have to consider that it takes more of the willingness of the government in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, and President Morsi to open up for the opposition.
But Ahmed Badawi, the fact is Egypt receives large sums, both from the US and from the EU, indeed one of the largest recipients of development support. An EU auditing committee on foreign aid has just concluded that the EU did not use its influence to the degree that it could have to try to help the government shape constructive political solutions. Would you say that's true, or do you agree with Ebtisam Ali Hussein that in fact donors have hands are tied?
Well, first, their hands are tied, and second, even if their hands are tied, I don't think they should intervene. This is an internal Egyptian political struggle. We're heading into a deadlock, and that's for sure, but that's the way it is, and we just have to accept that Egyptians need time to solve all these problems. The Europeans and the Americans, maybe the only thing they can do is not to worry about the current political situation and continue investing in the long-term future of Egypt. Infrastructure projects, these are projects for the Egyptian people. This is not for the government or for the opposition. Investing in youth, investing in education, these are long-term investments, and this kind of development aid should continue. But going back to a point that Jan was saying, I think there are two competing logics in Egypt now, and this is why I think we're heading into a deadlock beyond the 30th of June. There's the constitutional democratic legitimacy, and of course I agree. I mean, elections have been held, somebody won, a group won, and that's it. We should accept it and wait until the next round of elections come. But then on the other hand, there is still a lot of people are talking about revolutionary legitimacy. And for them, from the logic of revolutionary legitimacy, elections don't count. We can hold even more elections, 100 other elections if we want to, as long as the revolution continues. And these are the two logics that are competing now in Egypt. According which logic is going to prevail at the end, I hope that some agreement is reached without a lot of violence.
Ebtisam Ali Hussein, let me ask you, you talk about the continuity of the revolutionary idea. I'd like to come back briefly to my question in regard to the military and its role. To what degree is there continuity of the Mubarak power structures? To what degree are there still vestiges of the old structures within the military, perhaps within the courts, and could that become a problem if things do heat up?
The military during the time of Mubarak and even after the revolution, the only aspect that was visible and we were certain about it was the economic benefits that they had from the regime. The political interest was not quite clear. Actually, it was regarded as a byproduct of the economic interests in the country. The large investments in construction and infrastructure and so on. And of course, the economic privileges in terms of the laws entitling the generals, the major generals in the military, huge amounts of money. But nowadays they are talking about whether, I mean, in Egypt there is this debate whether the military will intervene or not. We have to consider that the most recent statement by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the head of the...
mentioned. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that it's actually, we have to view it as maybe he is threatening that the military would interfere on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood, because he was appointed by the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a very important turn, because before that, earlier, we would look at some statement like this as if it's a military intervention, as the military as an institution. Now it's not anymore. It's maybe even worse and partial than before.
Very interesting. So coming back then to the other point that we were talking about, what the international community can do, Jan Koolman. Ahmed Badawi has said, be patient, sit tight, and keep providing that crucial economic support. An IMF loan has been in negotiation for some time now, 4.5 billion euros. Would that help? Could that unlock other investment, other aid, and perhaps give Egypt some breathing room?
I think that Egypt urgently needs this loan because the government really just needs money to push up the economy, to invest in the infrastructure. I mean, you have so many problems in Egypt. Egypt really needs the money. And what is really important concerning the Western countries, I would say don't give any advices, because it's an Egyptian thing, and keep on with the communication and give money, because if the Western countries, if Europe doesn't give money, there will come more money from the Gulf states, from the very conservative monarchies from the Gulf, and I don't think that this has a positive influence on the democracy in Egypt.
From what I've heard so far from Ahmed Badawi, he is guardedly optimistic. Ibtisam Ali Hussein, would you say you share that view as you look toward the future of your country?
I agree with the fact that the foreign actors should not intervene, but I'm not that optimistic about the domestic politics, how they would evolve in the coming few months.
So you're expecting major violence after the 30th?
Yes.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.